Hey there, this is Jens, and this is actually my second YouTube video. I made my first one after I did an interview with a German YouTuber called Leroy Matata. Then I decided to produce content, as they say, but this is my first full video in which I talk about my life and my case, and also later on in the series about some of the people that I was locked up with. I'll also be talking about my life in prison and how I dealt with spending 33 years behind bars for a crime I did not commit. In this video today, I'm going to be talking about the death penalty, which I was under. I was under direct threat of the death penalty for 3 years, from June 13th, 1986 to July 7th, 1989. Back then, Virginia did not yet have the lethal injection. It was the electric chair. So that was a horrible death. And I had to live with the knowledge that I would most likely die in the electric chair for just over 3 years. And that was really, really hard. It affected my life. It changed my life. Changed my whole outlook on life. I was 19 when all of that started, and 22 when that part of my life under the death penalty ended. Looking back, I think I learned a lot from that, but I wouldn't recommend it. I really wouldn't recommend it. You know, I'm hoping that some of this will be interesting to you. This video combines two parts of what I want to talk about in this whole series. On the one hand, life in prison, but on the other hand, also a little bit about the case, which apparently there's still interest in that. What does an execution in the electric chair look like? These details are not known so much anymore because it's really interesting. When I was under the threat of the death penalty, they had the electric chair in Virginia, then they switched to lethal injection, and then a couple of years ago, they actually got rid of the death penalty in Virginia, amazingly. One way or another, I was part of that whole process. But back then, it was the electric chair. And what happens is that, of course, you're strapped into a big wooden chair, and your arms are tied down and your legs are tied down. And your head is shaved and your right calf is shaved, and they attach electrodes. And then you get an opportunity to say a few last words, because behind a glass wall there are observers, and these people are usually police officers, maybe prosecutors, defense lawyers sometimes, and also members of the victim's family sometimes there. So the person in the chair gets to say a few last words, and then they, back then, threw the switch and put 3,500 volts of electricity coming through the head and out the right calf. 3,500 volts. What does that do to a human body? The eyeballs come out of the eye sockets. You bite your tongue off. The hair on your arms begins burning. And of course, you have convulsions because there's so much electricity coursing through your body. After the initial jolt of electricity, a doctor comes in and checks your pulse and see whether you're still alive. And amazingly enough, quite a few people survive that first jolt of electricity. So once the doctor decides you're not dead, they turn the electricity back on and do the whole thing again. And once again, you know, all these horrible things happen to your body, you have these convulsions, and you start actually smoking. Reports by observers that there's a frying smell, really. And they say that it smells a little bit like fried pork. And they also say that the smell of fried human flesh, with the observers, it enters their clothing and it's really hard to wash out, apparently. I guess that's the smell of death in some sense. So after the second jolt of electricity, the doctor comes back in and checks again. And in a few cases, they actually had to use a third jolt of electricity before the person in the chair was actually dead. I think the longest execution in the electric chair took like 13 or 14 minutes. Yeah. From the age of 19 till the age of 22, I was in prison having to deal with the knowledge that I would almost certainly die that death. And and that was really, really hard. How did it happen that I came to be under threat of the death penalty for 3 whole years? To explain that, I'm going to have to go into the case a little bit. Apparently there's still interest in that, so I guess I'll talk about it. What happened was that on June the 8th, 1986, I confessed to the murders of Derek and Nancy Haysom, the parents of my then girlfriend, Elizabeth. I believed at that time that I could protect the woman I loved, Elizabeth, from this horrible death in the electric chair by taking the blame for this awful crime. And I thought I could do this without suffering the death penalty myself. My father was vice consul at the Consulate General in the United States. He was a German diplomat. And I thought I had a limited form, a partial form of diplomatic immunity. Of course, I knew that classic full diplomatic immunity rarely exists anymore. It's not totally out, but what usually happens nowadays is that when one commits a crime as a diplomat, one is not put on trial in the country where one is stationed, but one is brought back to one's home country and is put on trial there. And I had seen this happen myself while I was living in the United States in Atlanta, Georgia. A Japanese consular diplomat called Ryo Kanabe, I think, was arrested for a crime in Atlanta, and he was not put on trial in Atlanta. He was sent back to Japan and he was punished there for what he did in Atlanta. And that's what I thought was going to happen with me. I would be sent back to Germany. Now, the big difference between the United States and Germany is that in the United States, this crime is murder, of course, and as somebody who was 18 at the time of the crime, I would have been tried in an adult court. In Germany, by contrast, up until the age of 21, most of the time you're put in front of a juvenile court. And as an 18-year-old, always you're put in front of the juvenile court. And in Germany, at that time, the maximum penalty for any kind of crime was 10 years in prison. And you actually spent 6 years behind bars, and then you were released on parole, supervised release. So what I thought I was doing was, I thought I was offering or sacrificing, let's say 10 years of my freedom to save the woman I loved from dying this awful, awful death. And this was the partial diplomatic immunity that I had. Now, in the internet, there's all kinds of people saying, no, there's no such thing. Of course there is, okay? These are cases that are easily found on the internet. As recently as 2017, the daughter of a German diplomat in Washington, D.C., went to school with a knife and stabbed another girl at the school. Thankfully, the girl survived, okay? But neither she nor her parents were charged with crimes because they had diplomatic immunity. They were just sent back to Germany. And then there's a case of the wife of an American diplomat stationed in England. This is in 2019. And she killed somebody in a hit and run. And she also got diplomatic immunity. These, in both cases, the daughter of a German diplomat, the wife of an American diplomat, they're family members of diplomats, but they still had diplomatic immunity. That's not hard to find on the internet. In both of those cases, the diplomats were considered diplomatic staff at the embassy. And that's the big difference. My father was always at the embassy before and afterwards, but at this particular time in his career, he was at a consulate. And there's a little fine print thing in the international conventions on diplomatic relations that if the diplomat is stationed at the embassy, both he and his family are protected by diplomatic immunity. But if he's stationed at the consulate, only the diplomat is protected and his family not. And I did not know this when I gave my false confession on June the 8th, 1986. And then the next day, I finally got to see my lawyer. I'd been interrogated for 4 days about my journey. Before the interrogation, on June the 5th, I saw my lawyer briefly at court, and he told me, don't say a damn word. Keep your mouth shut, say nothing until I'm there. Don't speak to the police. And I had not listened to him. I had, on June the 8th, told the police, falsely, that I had killed Derek and Nancy Haysom. So on June the 9th, he sees me, my lawyer, and says, you have just destroyed your life because you did not follow my advice. I told you, don't say anything. And what did you do? You talked to the police, and now, almost 100% certainty, you're going to die in the electric chair. Because this is a horrible crime, and you confess to it. So there's almost no chance of getting out of it. You basically, more or less, just committed suicide. Why? Because you didn't keep your mouth shut like I told you to. I was 18 at this time. And I had just been told that I essentially committed suicide because I didn't keep my mouth shut. That's something that burned into my brain. I don't know whether you can imagine this, being told that you have to die because you talked. But this burned into my brain. Never talk again. Don't talk, no matter what you do. And I didn't. I didn't talk. I learned that lesson. Maybe wrongly. 4 days later, on June the 13th, it's Friday, June the 13th, I was charged with capital murder in Virginia. Death in the electric chair. You might think, why didn't you say, I didn't do it. My lawyer told me the only reason you're going to die is because you talked. Never talk. And like I said, it burned into my brain. What I learned was if I talk, horrible things will happen. Horrible things. My life ends because I talked. So I didn't talk. So what happened after I was indicted for capital murder on June the 13th, 1986? My lawyers made 3 attempts to save my life. The first and the second attempt both failed, but then finally the third attempt did succeed. Boy, those are some harrowing times. The first attempt to save my life centered on 2 British psychiatrists. The basic idea behind this was that in England, in Great Britain, these crimes could be classified as manslaughter instead of murder, manslaughter by reason of diminished responsibility. And therefore, the British government should only extradite Elizabeth and me for manslaughter, not murder. So this would have been a huge advantage for both of us, much shorter sentences. But for that to happen, 2 psychiatrists had to examine both Elizabeth and me in order to certify that in both of these cases, it's not murder, it's manslaughter by reason of diminished responsibility. And they did that. They visited her and they visited me and they examined us and they wrote the reports. And the whole point was that my lawyers could then go to the courts and say, look, in this country, Great Britain, this is only manslaughter. So you can't send them back for murder. And that did not work, and I'll tell you why in just a second. But it's important to understand that we all realized Virginia does not have a diminished capacity or diminished responsibility defense. In Virginia, you're either completely responsible and totally guilty, or you're insane, which basically means you hardly know who the heck you are and where you are, and extreme, severe psychosis, right? There is no middle ground. But in English law, there's this middle ground. Manslaughter by reason of diminished responsibility. And that's what the plan was of my lawyers. Get it downgraded in England first and then send them back to America on the downgraded charges. So the British judges, the extradition judges, did not go for that. They basically said that we are sending Elizabeth Haysom and Jens Soering back to America for a homicide, okay? Now, whether that homicide is manslaughter or murder, we don't want to decide that in England. So we're going to send them back and we're going to let the Americans decide, is it a murder or a manslaughter? All these examinations by the psychiatrists in England really didn't lead to the results that we wanted, and we, couldn't use them in America because they don't have diminished responsibility. So that was the first attempt that failed. First attempt to save my life. The second attempt to save my life revolved around a peculiarity in German law. In Germany, you can be tried in Germany for crimes committed abroad. So it was legally possible for me to be tried in Germany for the murders that happened in America. And again, the advantage is in Germany, it would be a youth court, a juvenile court, maximum penalty 10 years, whereas in America, it's an adult court, maximum penalty execution in the electric chair. So clearly, I wanted to go to Germany. The problem was that in order to hand in an extradition request, a government has to produce some kind of evidence that the person they want has committed some kind of crime. Otherwise, governments could just say to one another, Germany could say to England, or the United States could say to France, send me that guy, I want that guy. That wouldn't be right. So the government has to produce some kind of evidence. We want this person to come back to our country because we have this evidence against him that he did something wrong. Makes sense. The problem was the German government and the German prosecutor had no evidence against me to be used in a German court to show that I had anything to do with these murders. On June the 8th, 1986, I had given a confession to an American investigator. But the Americans did not give that confession to the German government. Of course not. Why would they, right? So the Germans had no evidence on which to base their extradition request, and they had to get some evidence. So what did they do? They sent a German prosecutor and my German defense lawyer to England, and they interrogated me on December 30th, 1986. And the whole point of this was to give the German prosecutor something that he could use to base his extradition request on. The end result was that, I lied to the police on June the 8th, 1986, taking the blame for a crime I had not committed in order to save my then girlfriend's life, so I thought. But then 6 months later, I had to tell the whole lie again, this time to try to save my own life from execution in the electric chair. And that didn't work either. The British government then had two extradition requests. They had the American extradition request with the confession I had given to the American investigator, and then they had the German extradition request with the confession I had given to the German prosecutor. And the British government had to decide between the two. Well, the crime happened in America, so we're going to send Soering to America. That kind of makes sense, right? It had to be tried, but, it didn't work. So they rejected the German extradition request and went with the American extradition request. And that was in January 1987. And that was the second attempt to save my life that had failed. So now my lawyers started a third attempt, and they filed an appeal to the European Court of Human Rights in Strasbourg, France. And they told me from the get-go, we cannot win this. We'll try it, and we can extend your life a little bit here in these cells, in prison, while you wait for the decision. But we cannot win this. We can't. And here's the reason why. At that time, some European countries still had the death penalty on their books for high treason. And England and France were two of them. So my lawyers could not go to the European Court of Human Rights and say the death penalty in and of itself is a violation of human rights, because some European countries still had it. They had to find some other argument, and they came up with two. The first one was the electric chair is a horrible way to die. There are more humane ways of executing somebody, like lethal injection. The European Court of Human Rights was not at all interested in that argument. The second argument they came up with was the so-called death row phenomenon. And that refers to the fact that after you've been sentenced to death, it takes years until you're finally executed. And during that time, you're locked in prison, basically just waiting to die. And that's really, really horrible. And it's called the death row phenomenon. And the argument was, this is a kind of torture. That's the argument they had to use at the European Court, because Some countries still have the death penalty. But they told me, my lawyers told me, the chances of this succeeding is like close to zero. So you might as well just get used to the idea. We're going to lose and you're going to get executed. And I lived like this basically for 3 years, with this high likelihood that I would die in the way that I described earlier, just a horrible death. And then came this surprise decision on July 7th, 1989, that nobody saw coming, least of all my lawyers and me, where the European Court said, yeah, making somebody wait years for his death, for his execution, that is a kind of torture, so you can't send him back. Boy, that was a shocker. And then for about 3 weeks, it looked like I was going to get sent back from England to Germany to be put on trial there. But then on August the 1st, 1989, the prosecutor in Virginia took the capital murder charge off the table and put in a first-degree murder charge, murder without the death penalty. And that meant that I could be sent back to the United States after all. So this option that had been out there, or this likelihood or possibility that I was going to be going to Germany, was gone. The prosecutor, Jim Updike, made that announcement on August the 1st, 1989, which was my 23rd birthday. And ironically, it was also his birthday because Jim Updike and I have the same birthday. And then it took like another 6 months or so for me to get shipped back to America and another 6 months for my trial to start. But that's the way that went from June 1986 to July 1989, living under the threat of the death penalty.